happy to tell Harmony's story. It just means a lot to me. She suffered a lot, and this is what I write about. This is what I'm writing about in the book. Really her story, her Massachusetts story, but I will tell you that her New Hampshire story is going to come out very soon. There's currently a lawsuit, a civil lawsuit filed by the mom, and what we're learning from that lawsuit is just shocking. So what happened to her here and what happened to her in New Hampshire is just unbelievable. But I've said this, so this is what I've said every single time about Harmony's story. Every single thing that could have gone wrong for that little girl did go wrong in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire. And as a result of it, she died a horrible death. So it's a very sad story. But I'll introduce it through the timeline, if I could. And Nick, let's just so that people understand what the timeline is.
I'm appealing to everyone. Help us find this little girl. Someone notice something, do what is right, and call in. I cannot emphasize that enough. Somebody out there knows something. It's time for people to do the right thing. I cannot say it enough. I cannot emphasize it enough.
On June the 7th, if I'm correct, Harmony's birthday, you have a tradition, right? I want you to tell our viewers about that. We have one of your tweets where you put some pictures up and you talked about what little Jameson says about how all rivers and oceans lead to heaven.
Jameson is a really special little boy, and he's 6 years old, and he is wise beyond his years, and he is also very matter-of-fact about his relationship with Harmony. He knows she has passed. He knows that she's in heaven. And my husband, Jonathan, and Jameson talk a lot about this, and talk a lot about, how to remember her.
He doesn't even know his sister's murdered, because as his dad and as Blair is his dad, it is our jobs to protect him.
It is important to talk about. I've read through many affidavits in my lifetime. We knew this was coming. We knew the details of this. But when you read through all that, it's, as you said, it's sickening. It's disturbing, beyond disturbing, to read the details of what was happening in this little girl's reality, knowing that it didn't have to happen. And I think that's truly the hardest part of all this.
Her face, her eyes, that smile, only the defendant, as we all sit and stand here today, knows where they are, and he can't afford to admit to you that he knows where they are, because the evidence contained on them will show that he caused her death. So she won't get the burial that everyone deserves. She doesn't get a headstone in the ground above the head that he battered. She doesn't get to be at peace in death because of what he did.
I still firmly believe that some people in some other agencies need to be held accountable. And I'm asking for that. This little 5-year-old girl, she deserves somebody to be held accountable that failed along the way. Because we wouldn't be standing here today if other people had done their job.
If Jameson was old enough to speak to this court today, he would want you to know the void that you left in his heart that can never be filled. Adam, he would plead with you to please tell us where she is. Let him have a place to go and remember his sister. Please.
Jameson's constantly asked us, where's Harmony? Recently, he once was struggling to go to bed. He looked off in the shadows of his closet and said, "Is that Harmony there?" Looking back at me. These are no questions for a little boy to be asking. He no longer could hold on to that hope.
Why did she die?
I wish she would have died, but she loves us, you know that?
Why does she have the hair no longer white?
Because she's an angel now, right? She doesn't need glasses anymore because she's an angel. You want me to put a berry on the top for you? How about right here?
I got permission from the Chief Justice to allow me to finalize the adoption of Jameson, and these are two of the most wonderful adoptive parents I've met, and it's just a wonderful family, and Jameson is safe and loved and happy.
I looked at my husband and I said, how did he leave? How did Harmony leave such a loving home and her foster family? How was she not kept with her brother and living with us today? How are they ripped apart? And that has to change because it could save these children's lives.
I think the biggest thing we ask is, what is it going to take to create the change? Because we've met with lawmakers, we've spoken with governor's offices, we've spoken with lawmakers in Washington. What is it going to take? There's already been a child that has been killed in a manner that none of us can even imagine. What will it take to create the change?
It's hard to see some of that, and it's even harder, I think, in the book. You'll see it's a very difficult read. I remember when I sent the first, when I sent the very first manuscript to Blair and Jonathan, who I have known for some time. Blair, who's a reporter, was on a plane flying to some event that he had to cover. And he sent me a message saying, "I just wept," and that was even before a lot of the things that you'll read in the book happened. It's been very hard for them. I met Blair and Jonathan in 2017 when I called Boston 25 because someone had told me there was a reporter there who had adopted children, and we wanted a speaker for National Adoption Day, which was huge in my court. I mean, we would do 40 or 50 adoptions in a day, and there would be hundreds of people there because the families were there and their extended families, and many people would come in. And I met him, and he and Jonathan, they had done 2 private adoptions and had 2 little boys. They were very small at the time, as you could see in the picture. Zeke and Cash were their 2 adopted boys. And we got to talking after Blair spoke, and I said, you should consider, I think the 2 of you seem like you could add another child to your family. I don't know what possessed me to say that. I didn't know them that well. But I said, if you ever want to think about adopting another child, maybe you'll consider adopting a child from foster care, because they were living in Massachusetts at the time. And when we had this conversation, Blair said, "Oh my gosh, I never realized how many kids are in the system and need a home." And I said, "Well, if you have a good home," and I gave them my card. I didn't expect to hear from them. And then a year later, in 2018, the phone rang, and it was Blair and Jonathan, and they said, "Guess what? We just went through the MAP training, which is the training program for the Department of Children and Families to become foster parents, and then you can become foster parents, and which might lead to adoption if you so choose." And they said, "We're in the program, we're waiting for the home study, and do you have any advice? Because we did it a while ago." And we got to talking and had these long conversations, and I tried to give them some advice about how to move the process along. And then at some point, they then called me and said, "Okay, we've been matched with a little boy to become his foster parents, but the parental rights haven't been terminated yet." And but that happens a lot. I said, "Well, it's a legal risk, like all cases with the Department of Children and Families. When you get a match, they'll tell you this is a legal risk adoption." There was no father involved in Jameson's life. His father is not Adam Montgomery, who was the father of Harmony. They had 2 different fathers, but it was the same mom. And so there was a day that they met Jameson, and it was just, they were immediately attached. They just didn't even want to wait another day. And he had been living with a woman, a wonderful woman, in Boston, but she said, he was only 2, she was in her 70s, and it was becoming more difficult, and so they're like, well, we'll take him. And I think after that initial visit, they then decided that they wanted to go ahead and adopt Jameson. And ultimately what happened was when the case came to trial, before the case came to trial, they met with the mom and they all decided to agree to an open adoption agreement, which is an agreement that they would adopt the children and that the mom could see the child once a year possibly, and that they would have contact. And so that's the story about how we met and how that happened. Little did I know, that any of us knew, that this was going to unfold like it did. And we kept in touch, of course. They ended up moving to Washington, D.C. when Blair transferred to Washington, D.C. to cover the White House, and so they were living in Virginia. And on New Year's Eve in 2021, I got a text message from Blair saying, Harmony's missing. And, from that point on, as you saw on that day, Chief Alden, he was fantastic, but he was just very, very involved in the case, right from, I think it's Aldenburg, it's in my book, I can't remember, but I've met him a couple of times. Wonderful guy. The police did a phenomenal job with this because no one knew if they would even ever find Harmony. I mean, that just wasn't, we just didn't know if that was going to happen. But it was very difficult for them because Jameson, at this point, had just turned 3, but always asked for Harmony. For a period of time, they were in foster care together. For a period of time, they were home together. And he would ask for her all the time, and they would take him to the park, and he would run up to, if he saw a blonde girl with eyeglasses, he would run up to her and say, "Are you my sister Harmony?" Or if the doorbell would ring, he would run to the door and he would say, "Harmony's coming for a visit." He's an amazing little boy, but has probably one of the best memories of any kid that I've ever known. I mean, he remembers everything. It's really interesting following him in school, where they'll hand him 10 spelling words, and he can tell you, not only can he tell you how it's spelled, if you say, well, we're going to do number 4, and he'll say, okay, household, H-O-U-S. He's got an incredible memory, and and that's good in some ways and very difficult in other ways. He asks a lot about her eyeglasses. And someone sent him, one of the foster moms sent him a pair of eyeglasses. I don't know if it was Harmony's, but it means a lot to him. This is a very important part of his life. The angel you saw him putting on the tree, I sent that to him from New Hampshire. And that was 2 years ago. And each year he's very careful about where that angel goes because that's his Harmony angel. And when he draws, it's interesting when he draws pictures in school, like and draw his family, he'll draw his 2 dads and his 2 brothers and the dogs, and then he always puts a heart in the sky and puts an H in it. And so it's always something that's really ever present with him. He knows, and it's in the book, and I think probably one of the hardest things for me in the book was writing those next to last 4 chapters, which I didn't actually write, but what I said to the 2 of them, when Harmony had disappeared, they said to me, how did this happen? I mean, you work in that system, how did it happen? And I said, well, let's take a look at it and let's write it. So they sort of encouraged me to write the book, and it was sort of a 2-year journey because, of course, things kept happening. But I think probably one of the hardest things was I said to them, well, I need you to be co-contributors to the book, and I knew I could never, with 3 kids, get them to sit down and write their own things, and so I said, well, sit down. I'm giving you 25 questions, answer them, and so Blair, being a reporter, had this this recording device that would transcribe it as they talked, and it's absolutely beautiful because they go back and forth just answering these questions. And I said, let's tell you a story from the beginning when they met and they wanted to be in a relationship. Blair talks about how difficult it was to come out as gay, not only to his own family, but he was a news reporter, I think, an anchor in North Carolina. How was that going to affect his life? And Jonathan was like, we're gonna get married at some time, and we're gonna have kids, and we're gonna have everything that everyone else has who wants a family. And Blair was, a little more withdrawn about that, and of course, eventually, they did get married, but ran into some obstacles in North Carolina when they adopted Cash. The state would only let them one of them adopt, because they didn't allow gay adoptions. And in California, which was kind of not a surrogacy thing, but a private adoption, that wasn't an issue. And of course, it wasn't in Massachusetts. And ultimately, when they got married, they were able to change Cash's birth certificate so that they're both on there. They go through and talk about, their life and each of the adoptions, and then what happened, the day they finally had to tell Jameson that Harmony had died, because they knew that people were talking about it. I think he was maybe in kindergarten at the time. It was a huge story, and so they knew that they were going to have to tell him at some time, and that was very difficult. We had conversations about that. How do you tell anyone? Just how do you tell anyone something like that? Never mind a child who was 5 at the time. And I'm writing this, and at times, just taking verbatim, and of course fixing the grammar, and kind of straightening it all out. But this was, I think, probably for me one of the hardest things that I had to write, and I just struggled with it. Every time I went to write it, I was just sort of crying, because I know them so well, and I knew how hard this was. And in that conversation, Blair says, and it's in the book, Blair says, we held it together as much as we could, which wasn't well, and we said, your sister is in heaven. And he said, what do you mean? And then Jonathan, talking to Blair about this, says, I think you said she passed away. And he said, did she die? And Blair responded to Jameson saying yes. And then Jonathan describes this scene of what happened, saying, and I've never seen a 5-year-old collapse like that. But he collapses in your arms, and for 30 minutes, into a puddle, he sobbed, and the only thing he says is, I wish she wouldn't have died. And I said, we wish that too. And we wish every day that murder had not been introduced into our family, into our life, and it's changed us forever. And it has changed them forever, because they're constantly dealing with it. And you saw Blair there when he's talking about the affidavit that came out. When the affidavit came out, they had charged Adam Montgomery with murder, but the affidavit came out, and it was so disturbing and so unbelievably difficult for them to take. And Jonathan, I was having these conversations with him. Jonathan said, I'm not going to post anything right now. I just don't know what to say. It's overwhelming, and it was overwhelming for both of them. But of course, what they were hearing were the horrific details from Kayla Montgomery, his wife, who was right there the entire time. She was there while in April of 2019, he punched Harmony in the head and gave her a black eye. They lied to the social worker. That's a whole other story from New Hampshire that's coming out now. But she was there the day they were in the car, and Harmony wet her pants, and he was already back using drugs, and he was a longtime criminal, had shot people in the head, had stabbed someone in the leg, pushed someone out of a car. He was sort of treated very gingerly by the judicial system in Massachusetts. And he had a 4-year sentence that got knocked back to a year. He was in and out of jail. He was in jail when Harmony was born. And he had been treating her incredibly cruelly the whole time he had her. And in this last day, he's driving down Elm Street in Manchester. She wets her pants. He becomes angry. He stops at a traffic light. He reaches behind him. He starts pounding her, punching her in the head, punching her all over the body, just repeatedly punching her. And then he stops at the next traffic light and again, repeatedly punching her in the head, punching her. She's crying, she's moaning. Kayla Montgomery's doing nothing. Admittedly, she herself was very abused by him. He beat her. There are pictures of her with black eyes, and I'm sure she was very afraid of him, but she had those chances to just step out of the car and stop it, and never did. And I have a chapter in the book called Stepmother or Step Monster. And, you know, it's just very hard to think of this. And then they get to the third traffic light, and he's punching her repeatedly in the head. And Kayla Montgomery, that's the affidavit that Blair is talking about that they're seeing. And then he hears Harmony moan and says, well, I think I may have done something to her this time, as if like he hadn't done something before for all the times that he was like beating her. And she was a tiny little thing too. So he gets out of the car, he takes her out of the car, and they're stopping, and they're on the side of the road somewhere, and he's not getting a pulse. He realizes that she has died, and just scoops her up, folds her in half, and puts her in an Under Armour bag, a duffel bag in the back of the car. And after that, he spent 3 months hiding her body. I have to say, the Manchester police and the state police and the marshals did an amazing job of tracking everything down after Kayla Montgomery, who had lied to the grand jury. She was facing 2 counts of perjury, 7 years each, 14 years. That's when she finally decided to, finally to tell the story. And then the police and the detectives went about very carefully going back to the family shelter they were in, where he hid her in the ceiling, and they got evidence from the ceiling where he had her. He was charged and convicted of abusing her corpse multiple times. Just, it's hard to even talk about, just crushing her body. It's in the book because it has to be, just so people will know how brutal he was, but it's very hard to read. But I will say the story starts in Massachusetts. And when we did the launch in Worcester at the Hanover Theater, we invited 100 people, and we had 100 people there. And Jonathan came up from Atlanta to talk to everyone, and Blair was going to come. And then, you might recall, because it was in September, there was a hurricane in Georgia, and then, of course, the news people said, no, you have to stay, you have to cover the hurricane. Nick, can you pull, and so Blair sent a message to the crowd that day, where he just talks a little bit about how important it was to them. I mean, he's very nice to me about it, but they were involved with the writing of the book all along. Upside down, Nick. And so he wanted to send a message because he got called back, and we'll see if Nick can get it up. But it's for them, this book has sort of become important. They know it might be important to Jameson when he's older. They have not told Jameson that Harmony was murdered. And he's asked a couple of times, but they don't feel that he's prepared at this point to be able to actually be able to manage the news. I mean, he's 8 years old, and it's just too soon. They have just, oh my gosh, they have just such a wonderful life. Blair was a paramedic in Massachusetts when he was here, and he was the head paramedic for down on the South Shore. Sure. And Blair was a reporter. Now, when they went to Virginia, Jonathan went to nursing school and became an emergency department nurse, and that's what he does in Atlanta. He works in the emergency room and in critical care. He really has a lot of medical knowledge. I think it has been very hard for them because I had to basically set out for them what I believed happened. So what you have to understand is that they would not release the trial transcript of this one-day trial that happened. So it's hard to explain exactly how it went down because there's so much to it. But basically, this is how I start the book off, because I've had to find the right way. And when I do these kind of presentations, I always sort of read the first chapter, which I call A Lethal Trajectory, and the subchapter is called Missing Pieces. And this is how the story starts. Albert Einstein once said, "The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing." This is the story of evil and of so many who looked on and did nothing. It's the story of what happened to a beautiful little girl once so full of life before unspeakable sadness took over. It's the story of a precious child named Harmony and the Massachusetts child welfare system that failed her at every decision point. That's a quote from the state's own child advocate. It's the story of how those who looked on and failed to protect her left tiny Harmony's very life in jeopardy. It's the story of a broken child protection system and the ones who simply do not want to fix it. And it's the saddest story of all because it could have ended so differently. So many mistakes. And so this is, Blair's view of the book, and this was his message while he was busy covering the hurricane in Atlanta.
Good afternoon, everyone. I wish I could be there in person with you today. Jonathan and I both believe this book is such an important piece of what needs to happen next to make sure there isn't another Harmony Montgomery. And as some of you know, our son Jameson will forever struggle to understand why his sister isn't alive and why he won't be able to see her ever again. We've said many times, and frankly too many times, that not enough is being done to make sure this doesn't happen again. It is time for lawmakers to be brave and bold and take action. It is time for people to hold their elected officials accountable and demand that more be done. That's why Jonathan and I want to be part of this book. We believe it will lead to change and progress to save children from facing the ultimate tragedy that so many of us can't imagine. We can't begin to thank Judge Erskine for her friendship and kindness. We also can't articulate just how truly grateful we are for her tedious work on this book, day in and day out. She has not given up. She is committed to seeing that change. Judge Erskine, thank you for taking on this difficult job. You are truly making a difference in this world and to our family. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the support. Our family, and especially our son Jameson, will value it for a lifetime.
So, very kind words, but they have been involved in this with me virtually from the very, very beginning. And I think that's one of the reasons we decided together that we did not want people saying we were profiting off of a sad story like this, and decided that we would donate the profit from the book to the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, to the part of the agency that finds foster homes for hard to adopt kids, older kids, kids with disabilities, sibling groups. And so they have a group there that contacts various states and social workers and agencies in different states and helps find homes for these kids. So the thing I'll say about Massachusetts, which is the main story in the book, is that from the minute Harmony had disappeared, Governor Sununu in New Hampshire went on television, and it was nationwide, saying, how is it even possible that anyone would put that child with that monster? How did that happen in Massachusetts? And which is why the subtitle of the book is How Massachusetts Put 4-Year-Old Harmony in the Hands of a Monster, because from the beginning he was called a monster. And truly, he is. He is just a person that is filled with rage, and it didn't matter who got in his way. And so I start in the book, I talk about the fact that from the very beginning, Massachusetts responded to the governor through Chief Justice Budd, who's the Chief Justice of the SJC, the Supreme Judicial Court, and said, well, we're going to take, we'll review this and we'll take what she called every responsive measure in order to, address this issue. Well, I mean, that was, let's see, 3 years ago now. Haven't seen a thing from the SJC. And when I talk about this, a lot of people in the system, because I was a judge in that system, so I got a lot of people who were friends and colleagues, who are sort of unhappy that I'm sort of revealing some of these secrets that took place in this case and that take place all the time in the system. And so what happened is, I picked up the phone at one point and I called Senator Moore and I said, look, the recommendation of the Office of the Child Advocate, who produced this 100-page report about Harmony's case, said you need to set up a working group. So let's set up, and we worked and drafted legislation to have a Harmony Commission so that they could look at the defective child welfare laws that put her in the position she was in, to say nothing of the legal system in Massachusetts. And what happened was he filed the legislation, and it went through the committees, went through the House and Senate, and then the House Speaker, Mariano, crushed it on the last day. And then did an interview with Boston 25 saying, well, we don't know who the stakeholders are yet. It's like, it was just crazy. So then in 2023, September 2023, Blair and Jonathan and I, through Mike Moore and through others, that it's the actual trial court and the juvenile court themselves that are asking the legislature not to pass it. So you might ask why. They don't want the secrets out there. They don't want anybody to know what happens behind closed doors. I was a judge for 20 years. My courtroom was never open. It was always closed. It's always a secret. And there's reason for that. I mean, you don't want to have, child abuse cases, an open court. I mean, a lot of the cases I heard were kids that had fractured skulls, broken arms, sexual abuse, everything the gamut. Kids caught up in domestic violence, kids left alone, substance abuse. I had 4 cases of murder-suicides where I had to make decisions about what was going to happen to those kids because they would immediately come in to the department's care. And had a number of cases of domestic violence where parents were so severely injured that the other parent being incarcerated, that there were times that we just had to find homes for these kids. And so there's a lot that goes on in the juvenile court. And of course, you want that confidentiality, but not to the extent that you have something like this and you can't figure out what happened. So the Office of the Child Advocate wrote this 100-page report. They got to listen to the trial. So I'll tell you this about the trial, because I've done many of these trials. Harmony was in custody in Massachusetts for 4 years and 8 months. All but 15 months she was in foster care with a wonderful foster parent. But 3 times the Department of Children and Families took her out of the home, put her back, relapse, took her out of the home, kept her for months and months, put her back, relapse, took her out of the home again, and so there were 3 times that they sent Harmony home, and that's one of the big criticisms of DCF in this case, because by law we're supposed to finish those cases in 18 months. But when I left in 2023, just 2 years ago this month, there were 1,100 open child abuse cases in my court, where I was the first justice and had to assign judges, and only 5 judges hearing them. There were 2,212 kids in foster care under our jurisdiction, and that didn't count all the other cases we hear: runaways, sexually exploited kids, truancies, adoptions, guardianships, criminal cases of every kind, because in juvenile court in Massachusetts, juvenile court judges hear every kind of criminal case up to murder. Murder, if you're 14 or over, you're going to be tried in the Superior Court. Otherwise, rapes, robberies, firearms cases, those are all heard in the juvenile court. And so it becomes very difficult to get cases heard. This case lasted 4 years and 8 months and must have had thousands. I've seen these cases. It would have thousands of pages of documentation from DCF. How long did the trial last? Because the parents had been already found unfit and both petitioned then to get their kids back. The court never terminated their rights and they never put Harmony up for adoption. And so what happened is they said, okay, well, the parents have a right to ask us to give the child back. And they held that hearing on one day in February. The entire trial lasted about 7 hours. That's how long it lasted. So, of course, when I read the Office of the Child Advocate report, I could easily tell how things went wrong because I've been in that system for 20 years, so I knew what happened. And so the Office of the Child Advocate, throughout the book, I talk about, this is what they said. They said that the father's lawyer held the position that the father should get custody back because he had been substance free for like 6 months. But yet the father had only seen Harmony 20 times in that 5 years in a DCF office. That's the only time he had ever seen her, and walked out with custody. And he had a massive criminal record. 22, he was living he was from New Hampshire and living there, had 22 items on his criminal record in New Hampshire. And in Massachusetts, as I said, he shot someone in the head during a drug deal. In New Hampshire, he pushed someone out of a car. He had domestic cases. He held 2 women at gunpoint in an apartment somewhere around Boston. I mean, he just had this lengthy criminal record, but it was a criminal record of utter violence. Every part of his criminal record was violent, and virtually every part of his criminal record involved weapons, either a knife or a gun or some kind of firearm. And so that was there also. He knew nothing about Harmony's special needs, and she had a lot of special needs. She had a condition called septo-optic dysplasia. So she was born with another diagnosis, and they said she's blind in both eyes and she's going to have all kinds of problems, growing problems, all kinds of problems. But she started to overcome those problems, and they realized that she didn't have the original diagnosis, but she had this diagnosis called septo-optic dysplasia. She was blind in one eye, had vision problems in the other eye, and as a result of it, she had, there were neurological issues, she had some motor issues. She overcame a lot. She was just an amazing, sparkling, beautiful little girl, but still had these issues. And he knew nothing about those issues. He knew she was blind in one eye, but he never went to a doctor's appointment, which parents can do, never learned anything about her special needs. I mean, she had protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act that the Department of Children and Families did nothing about. And so they have this trial, so you'll ask me why I know, because everybody does. Well, how did it happen? You know, because so many people were blaming the judge. People were saying, look, something terrible happened. Why would this judge give this man custody? Well, here's what happened. And it's very clear from the OCA report to find out what happened in this 6-hour trial. Well, first of all, the mother wasn't there. And the reason she wasn't there was because Jameson's case in Boston was on the very same day, which to this day amazes me, because I've had that happen lots of times as a judge. And I say, oh, you have a case in the other court? Let me call the other judge and see if we can arrange. I mean, Jameson's case was on for a pretrial conference, which is important. Harmony's case was on for a custody hearing, and she had a petition for custody. But instead, the lawyers and the judge said, well, why don't you contact her to see if she still wants to go ahead with the case? Well, she did. She had called the court the day before and said, can I get a continuance? And the clerk said no. And then the lawyers for the mother, the lawyer for the father, and the lawyer for Harmony all sort of pushed the lawyer for the mom to call her in Boston. So in a phone call, he called her, and then went back into court, according to the OCA that listened to the trial, and said, oh, the mother's in agreement to go forward, which she adamantly denies, and which is believable because it's a matter of record that she asked for a continuance. Even her lawyer did that day. And he said, and she's okay with Adam Montgomery having custody, which she just screams about. Says, absolutely not. He was brutal to me. He strangled me, tried to suffocate me when I was pregnant with Harmony, and she had her own case on. So the trial goes on without her. I write a lot about that in the book. And her lawyer then sort of sits down and does nothing, doesn't ask any questions, nothing. So he's not asking any questions to Adam Montgomery about anything. He just sits down and does nothing. And then Harmony's lawyer takes the position that Harmony should go with his father, who the lawyer must know, they have all the records, they have the information, that he's only seen 20 times, that he knew nothing about her special needs, he knew nothing about her psychological, developmental needs, knew absolutely nothing about her medical condition, had this massive criminal record, and she takes the position that Harmony should go with him because 4-year-old Harmony instructed her to take the position at trial that she should go with her father. That was the lawyer's position. I mean, I mean, come on. So I write a lot about this in the book because Massachusetts is only one of 9 states that has a rule that lets children decide with their lawyer what their position is. Although I personally don't believe that Harmony took this position, and said, I want to go with this man. I write about it in the book very sarcastically, and a lot of people, mention that to me. But in the book I say, yes, how did that conversation go? I mean, Harmony, would you like to go with the man that pushed someone out of a car, stabbed him in the leg? He's the man that shot someone in the head and held 2 women at gunpoint. Is that the person, that guy that you've only seen 20 times? Is that the guy that you want to go with? And the one that knows nothing about your vision problems, about your upcoming surgeries, about your special needs, is that how that went? Well, they knew. The lawyers knew that it was going to be a problem. So they basically, the lawyer then said during the investigation, well, I also use substituted judgment. I mean, Harmony told me that, but the law allows me to substitute my judgment, which means that she has to decide if Harmony were older and competent, what position she would take. And then she said she still found that Harmony would take that position. Again, I ask in the book, how'd the lawyer come to that position? Did she say, well, I don't really care about this criminal record, it's not relevant, I don't really care that he doesn't know anything about her special needs, I don't really care that he's only seen her 20 times. I mean, how did they come to that position? Which is really interesting because I was able during my research to track down a confidential private memo that the Committee of Public Counsel Services sent to the OCA because the Office of the Child Advocate said, look, we need to change the legal system. I've been screaming about this issue while I was on the bench. We have to change the legal system. We can't have a legal system where a kid can just say, I've had kids, I write about this in the book, I've had kids because judges have to at least see and talk to every kid that's before the court, not necessarily interview them. But I've interviewed and seen a lot of kids who were sexually abused, and some of them say, I want to go home with my mom and dad. They don't want to be in foster care. And they're willing to say, this is a very common phenomenon, that children want to go home with abusers. I mean, many kids can be reunified. I reunified hundreds of kids with their parents. Maybe it's a substance issue, they got treatment, maybe there was domestic violence, they got therapy, and marriage counseling, whatever, and you send those kids back home. But not every kid can go back home. And so I got a hold of this private memo that the Committee for Public Counsel Services, which is the ones that put the lawyers in for indigent parents and children, and I got a hold of a memo that said something different than what they told the OCA and what's in the report. And I write about that in a book. It's called The Confidential Response to the Office of the Child Advocate report on Harmony Montgomery. And in it, they said it was Harmony's goal to be with her father. So they didn't say anything about substituted judgment, nothing like that, that this 4-year-old sat there and said, I want to go with this man that she had only seen 20 times. Which is interesting because She didn't even call him dad. The only person she called dad was the foster father. And it's interesting because I talked to the foster mother last week. She had gotten in touch with me. She had seen the book, and I had a conversation with her, and she was a lovely, Harmony was with her 3 times. And she loved Harmony. And, you know, she said, Harmony called my husband dad, which is true. Everybody knew it. So nobody, I think a lot of people do not believe Harmony said this, and should it be that way? So everybody asks me then, with all of this, why would the judge make that decision? Well, because you had 3 lawyers, and you had the Department of Children and Family lawyer who was opposed to Harmony going with her father. But they had done such a poor job in DCF of managing the case. In fact, they had never really, they gave the father visits, but they never did the study on the father, the family study that had to be done. They never interviewed his wife, Carol Montgomery, who was still a substance abuser at the time, while this was all going on. She never stopped using drugs. So they were and no one asked about her at the trial. And so, so DCF's case, according to the OCA, was just weak, and they just couldn't present a lot of evidence. And what did the father put on? The father puts the father on. He's like, I'm fine, my criminal past is long past, which wasn't true. He was in jail when the case started for shooting someone in the head. And so what happened is the 3 lawyers, by the way, who all work for the Committee for Public Counsel Services, they're all hired by the Committee for Public Counsel Services, they're all paid by the Committee for Public Counsel Services, they're all supervised by the Committee for Public Counsel Services. So you have 3 lawyers who all work for the same agency in that courtroom. And each one of them took the position. The mother's lawyer said, I'm in agreement because the mother told me that, which she denies. He asked no questions. And then you have the father's position, which of course he had to represent that. So he puts the father on the stand, and the father's like, nope, I'm doing fine. And the child's lawyer asks only very simplistic questions according to the OCA. Just very simple questions. Never asks him what Harmony's special needs are, who her doctors are, does he have school placement for her in New Hampshire, does she have an ophthalmologist? She never asks him why he only visited 20 times. No one ever tells the judge that he missed an entire year of visits, where he never even saw her, never talked to her, never called a social worker, never asked about her. Whole year of visits he missed, an entire year. And then there were months at a time when he didn't see her. They didn't tell the judge that he didn't visit. They didn't tell the judge that he knew nothing about her special needs. The OCA admits this. And they didn't put his criminal record in. So the judge had no idea. So people ask me, how does that happen? Because, you know, they're like, come on, you know, you were a judge. I mean, come on, you know, like this judge, I mean, it was a record this big. But as I explained in the book, you know, some judges, like if it were me, I might have done something different. I might have said to someone, is anybody going to put the criminal record in? Because criminal records are part of these cases all the time. But you take a chance when you do that as a judge, because the appeals court has told us as juvenile court judges, you know, you can ask questions to clarify, but you can't become a prosecutor and you can't become a defense attorney. So they issued a case law telling us, don't ask questions unless to clarify. Well, this was it's probably a 6-hour trial, 7 maybe, because they had time when they talked to the mother. And so the father testified, the social worker testified, but not very much because she didn't know very much, or he, because they didn't do the evaluation of the father. He didn't show up and they let it go, even though the family assessment has to be done by law. The department itself didn't follow the law. And on top of it, the department, I think, they knew in Harmony's last few days, the foster mother, I've talked to her, they had to give up having Harmony in the last 2 months because Harmony had so many special needs and had so much trauma from being taken out and back and forth. And the department put no services in for her at all, none. They put her on a wait list. That was what Harmony got. And so that's really one of the stories I'm screamed about is sort of the legal representation. Because the other half of what happened in court that day was that the father's lawyer asked that the judge, when the judge gave the father custody, asked that there be no interstate compact. And an interstate compact is where, when I was a judge and someone said, well, we want to send the child with his father in Missouri, then I'm gonna make sure that there's a home study in Missouri. It's called an interstate compact, and that means if the child's going to another state, that there should be a home study. But in Harmony's case, again, it worked against her, because the law in Massachusetts said, yes, there should be a home study, even if it's a parent. But in New Hampshire, they said, no, there should only be a home study if it's a foster care placement or an adoption. And so the judge said, well, that's the law in New Hampshire, and then doesn't order a home study. And the child's lawyer says, oh, I'm fine with her going without a home study, even though the law in Massachusetts is there should be a home study. Or she or he, that lawyer could have asked the judge to appoint a special advocate, like a CASA volunteer or a GAL. Nothing like that happened. Harmony goes to New Hampshire in February, and by April he was beating her. He was having her kneel on the floor for hours at a time. He was having her scrub the floors with a toothbrush, scrub the bathroom with a toothbrush. He was hitting her, he was abusing her, until DCYF got involved in New Hampshire and essentially did nothing, which is another whole story. But so the ICPC is a big issue. So Blair and Jonathan and I, as he was talking about, we're working with Senator McGovern to try to reset the rule federally that there has to be a home study. Because if there had been a home study, she'd be alive today. Because a home study means that a social worker has to go into that home for 6 months. They have to first of all, they have to do a whole study. So if they had done the study, they definitely wouldn't have sent her there, because he had a massive criminal record of rage and anger. So she would have stayed in Massachusetts. So everything worked against her. And so she ends up going there, and then terrible things, of course, happen to her. And so one of the things that I have been screaming about, especially lately, I was just on Court TV talking about this, because a media company filed in Essex they want the court to open up that hearing that I write about based on the OCA, so that people can hear what happened. And the Supreme Court justices said, one of them said, isn't it important for us? This little girl has died. And don't you think it's important for us and the public to know exactly what happened in that hearing? But the judge who issued the decision saying, no, the media can't have it, issued it for very valid reasons. And so the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts has to say that she abused her discretion, because there's a rule that says you can't open up hearings without good cause, and it's never a good cause if it's for entertainment purposes. And the media person that did it is someone who's making a documentary. And so there was a lot of discussion before the SJC. So I'm speaking about this publicly in a number of different forums, saying the interesting thing to me about that is it's now 4 years later, and you have a Supreme Judicial Court justice saying, isn't it important that we find out what happened? Isn't that at the bottom of this? Isn't it important, something terrible went wrong? And I had to comment, although it doesn't endear me to any of the judges of the Supreme Judicial Court or other justices, saying, where were they 3 years ago when the Chief Justice said, we'll take all responsive measures? What happened to those? Nothing. They have a secret committee inside the court, and who's on the committee? The committee, who's on that secret committee? CPCS, who, after Harmony disappeared, and the governor said, well, let's have a special advocate for every child and not just a lawyer. And CPCS said, no, we're against that. They said, sad facts make bad law. Like, don't make a bad law giving a child every advocate, which of course I'm pretty brutal to them in the book, saying, here are the sad facts. And then I write about what happened to her that final day. I said, those are the sad facts. The moment that he was punching her. And so it's the legal system that is the problem and that we're trying to change. And so I'm angry about the Supreme Judicial Court. I mean, I hope maybe they'll open it up, and that's great. I think it will confirm exactly what I've said in the book. But I'm angry about the fact that they said, don't you think this is important? When the Chief Justice said there would be these responsive measures, and then what they do and what they do, they set up a secret committee. In the book, I call it ovum lupo comitere, a Latin phrase, to set a wolf to guard the sheep. And that's the way I feel about it. What good is that committee? You know, it's all the people that were responsible for her death, in my view. And so, you know, it's frustrating. And then the other frustrating thing that I talked about too, when asked about it, I said, who do you think is responsible for approving the rules of the Committee for Public Counsel Services lawyers? Who has oversight of them and approves the rule, including that a 4-year-old can do that? The Supreme Judicial Court. So here they are, you know, speaking out for Harmony, saying maybe we should open this and everybody should know, and yet they're the ones that authorize the rule that allows a 4-year-old to make those decisions. So that's a lot to say about the book, but we're trying to change the law. That's why we have Senator Moore. We want an independent committee. And then tomorrow, there's another whole story in New Hampshire that I'll talk about later on, but I'm meeting with 3 state reps tomorrow in New Hampshire to deal with the fact that she was completely ignored. It's really sad in New Hampshire because I think the police were really the only ones, you know, they had filed reports of abuse, like as the chief will tell you, they do in Massachusetts. They file reports of abuse. A lot of them were ignored. In New Hampshire, there were 18 reports filed in New Hampshire, 17 reports of abuse saying she's being abused, she's being hit, she's being sexually molested. 18 reports. You had police officers filing reports. And interestingly, when they were driving down that road, Elm Street in New Hampshire, there was, at one point, they were stopped by the police, and Harmony was in the back seat, badly beaten. And what did he do? He took a comforter and he put it over her so you could only just, you know, like see the top of her head. So, and said, oh, she's sleeping, so that or something like that. But there was an event where, and Carol Montgomery testified to this, where they would cover her up with a comforter in case anybody could see her. So he knew how to evade the police. But the sad part about it is that, you know, for her, she just never really had a chance. She didn't have a chance here, she didn't have a chance there, and it just ends, the sad story just ends with just a beautiful little girl who just had so much to offer, and everything worked against her. So we're hoping in New Hampshire we're going to get changes in the law. We hope we're going to get changes in the law in Massachusetts. But you can just imagine, it's hard to imagine what it was like just with this ride going down Elm Street and how badly she was abused. And it's hard to think about. People tell me about the book, it's very hard to read, that they stop. And you know, it impacts a lot of people's lives. Of course, it impacts Blair and Jonathan's life and Jameson's life. And they're gonna have to find a way to tell him at some point. So that's the story. So questions for discussion? Anybody have any questions? A lot of people ask me questions, but hopefully I answered most of them through talking about this. Anybody have any? Chief?
Carol, what do you think the motivation of Harmony's biological father to get her back?
Yep.
What do you think the motivation?
It's a great question. He had one motive, and that's to make sure that the mother didn't get her, because he hated her. He hated the mother. And in his murder trial, his best friend testified at the murder trial in New Hampshire and said, they said, what did he say to you about Harmony? And she said, she reminds me of her mother, and that I hate her to my very core. That's what he was saying. So he despised that little girl. And, you know, that's really was his motivation. And where did it get him? I mean, he had drug dealers testifying against him in the murder trial. I mean, before the murder trial, he was on trial for multiple firearms. He was buying and selling firearms. The house was loaded with firearms, and it was loaded with drugs, and yet you had a social worker assigned to the case in New Hampshire. Very interesting. This social worker, I'm watching the trial, and commenting on it at times on Court TV or wherever. And so I'm listening intently. And so the social worker gets up and they ask him, there was a child abuse report on July 29th, and it was filed by the uncle who had flown home from Florida on July 22nd, saw this huge black eye, marks on her face, I mean, just terrible injuries. And he waits a few days, can't handle it anymore, and he calls DCYF and says, you know, my niece has this, you know, terrible black eye, my nephew's back on drugs. I said, what happened to her? And he said, I bashed her around the house. And tells the uncle that. The uncle testified to that at trial. And so he gets assigned a social worker. So if you can believe it, as Harmony's horrific, sad luck continues in New Hampshire, they assign a social worker, okay, to him. It's just revealed that this social worker was a police officer, all right? He got involved in domestic incidents, punched a wall, decertified in New Hampshire, but he was under the New Hampshire umbrella because he was a police officer at a hospital. So he appealed it, and they didn't undo the certification. They gave him a certification back years later, but he never went back to policing. But he was a police officer, so what did they do? They said, well, you know, we're going to put you somewhere else. So where did they put him? They put him in DYS, like the Department of Youth and Detention Center for juveniles who had committed crimes. So they put him in a place to work with these juveniles. And who does he work with there and get to know? Adam Montgomery, who was in that detention center when he was a juvenile. And he knows Adam, right? He then gets charged with sexual harassment of women in the Department of Youth Services. He fights it, but they uphold it, but he appeals it, and they say, well, you have to leave there. So they take him out of there, right? And where'd they put him? DCYF, where he becomes the social worker on Adam's case, right? He's the social worker on Adam's case. And he says to Kevin Montgomery, the uncle, who called me, got in touch with me on Facebook, and I've spoken to him several times, and he talks to him, and he says he knew who this social worker was. He said, you were Adam's, you know, counselor. They had a counselor relationship, and he says, and you were his counselor, and you're on the case. And he says, well, you know, I probably shouldn't be assigned to the case, but as far as, you know, the black eye, I wouldn't. He said, Adam's not like that. He said, so they knew from the beginning, right? So he's on the case, July 29th, by New Hampshire law, because it's a physical abuse case in New Hampshire. Physical abuse and sexual abuse means that the social worker has to go and immediately see the child. So in the murder trial, he testifies that he did go, because he had to right away, that's the law there, and that he's 40 feet away, and he sees Adam Montgomery, who he knows, of course, getting into his car with someone that he said was a little girl. He could just see her blonde hair. He couldn't see what her face was, and never sees her. But under New Hampshire law, by law, a social worker, if there's a physical abuse case, has to call the police or the multidisciplinary team. So in New Hampshire, there's always a police officer or a law enforcement official on the multidisciplinary team. And in Manchester, it was the Manchester Police. So which means he had to notify them to come and see the child if there was this black eye or physical abuse. But instead of doing that, he sends them an email saying, I saw the child today, I assessed her at the car with the father, which of course wasn't true. There's no bruises, there's no black eye, so then the police are out of it. They're out of the case. So there's no police officer going out to check it out. But on the witness stand, he had to testify that he didn't evaluate her, that he only saw her. Now, how is it that he happened to just drive up that minute when Adam Montgomery's taking her out of the house? And so finally, Kayla Montgomery admits on the witness stand that the social worker, which is against their policy and rules because it's physical abuse, called Adam ahead of time, said, I'm coming, let them know. They're saying you're not taking care of the kids. They had 2 other children. And so Adam, quickly gets up and takes Harmony out of the house. And then he talks to Adam. He says, well, I'm coming tomorrow. Adam's like, oh, there's a doctor's appointment tomorrow, as if he ever took Harmony to a doctor. And then he says, well, we'll go and I'll see her. They make an appointment for August 7th. Well, the injury happened on July 22nd, so by August 7th, there's really nothing there. So in the murder trial, he had to testify that there was a red mark because everybody knew by that time that there had been that. And that's just the start of the story with him. I mean, he had to call, by law, he would have to call the pediatrician, right, to say if there's any, that's what he had to do by law. What did he do? He called, now we know, he called the pediatrician and said, I'm calling about the Montgomery children. Well, she had been taking care of he and his wife's 2 little boys. And he calls and he says, how are the Montgomery children? The pediatrician says, fine. Is there any abuse? Nope. Are they up to date with their shots and all of that? And the doctor says, yes. Then Harmony disappears. They interview the doctor. The doctor's like, I never heard of Harmony till this happened. He never mentioned her black eye, never mentioned, that she had, vision problems, never mentioned, she said, I knew nothing about her and never saw her. All he did was ask me about the children. And assuming, of course, that I knew, that he was taking care of the other children. So, there's this whole notion that we're looking at with state reps about pursuing some kind of legal response in New Hampshire under federal law. So Harmony just, and so I'll end with this, although it's a sad note, but maybe I'll end it with Blair and Jonathan. The way it ended was with DCF is they said, when he finally did see her, he said, the parents said that the little boy hit her in the eye with a lightsaber or some toy. He bought that, but they kept the case open for 3 months. He had to go out there once a month and said everything was fine, even though every drug dealer that testified at the firearms trial said the house was filled with drugs and needles and paraphernalia. Kevin Montgomery has since sent me pictures of the house with stuff everywhere, cluttered, messy house, refrigerator with old food falling out of it, and Harmony had trouble walking around obstacles. And so supposedly he went there for 3 months, and in that 3 months, never made sure that Harmony was in school, so she was never in school, never made sure that she saw a pediatrician or a doctor, never made sure that she saw a therapist. She was just trapped in that house like a prisoner. And for 3 months, so October 17th comes, and they contact Kevin Montgomery because he was the original person who filed, and they said, we have made a finding that your allegations of physical abuse are unfounded, and we're closing the case October 17th. 6.5 weeks later, she was dead. He beat her to death. So that's the New Hampshire story that's going to be coming out soon. But in the meantime, I will say this about Jameson and the boys, these brothers, they're lovely. These are wonderful, lovely, loving parents. Jameson is doing great, sent me pictures. He was Student of the Month, and sent me a picture holding his Student of the Month sign. And they're just the most joyful, wonderful, loving parents that you would ever want to know. So it's a lovely, wonderful friendship. But thank you so much for listening to me. I really appreciate it also tonight. But I hope that answered your question. Any other questions about what happened?
So the mother is not Kayla, it's that Corey woman?
Yeah, it's Crystal Sorey.
So what is she doing now?
Okay, so Crystal has had her ups and downs as well, but she wanted to be there for that. She wanted to be there for the trial. She's made that clear. She's been maintained her sobriety for quite some time. She's engaged. She has another child. She's been kind of upfront about this on Facebook, that the child has some disabilities, but she's maintained her sobriety. And she was homeless for a while, but in a shelter. But according to her, she's doing quite well. So it's really a sad story. A lot of people are very critical of her because she relapsed 3 times. I mean, I learned that relapse is, not uncommon in cases like this. But the problem was they waited too long. They did it 3 times. They took her out, they put her back, they took her out, they put her back. She had a lot of mental health issues as a result of that. But I mean, I think, Crystal Sorey, seems to be doing pretty well. A lot of people are very critical of her. She just filed a civil lawsuit, and I'm glad that she did, because that's how we now learned about all these 17 of child abuse reports. But people are very critical of her, oftentimes saying, well, you know, she wouldn't have been in custody if it wasn't for you, and now you're just making money off of it. I mean, her daughter died, you know, so I have, I think, a lot more sympathy for Crystal Sorey than maybe many people do. She was 16, I think, when she had Harmony. And you know, listening to her story, I write a little bit about it in the book. I mean, she said, I didn't know. They told me to get services. They kicked me out of the shelter. She comes from a very abusive background, domestic violence, parents in jail. So it's not uncommon for kids who come from very difficult backgrounds and trauma backgrounds like that to be involved in substances. So we've seen it hundreds of times. And so, you know, hers is a different story. No criminal record, nothing like that. So it's just a sad story. I think if she had been there, she would have walked out with custody. But yeah, it's very sad. She's doing well. Thanks for the question. Anything else? Anybody else want to say anything? Sad story, right? Yeah. So, but thanks everybody. If you read the book, you got to read it slow. I want to thank Grafton and the chief and Mary Ann, you know, who arranged this, for letting us use their training room, the library room. As a lot of you know, had been flooded, so it's really hard to get in there, even though they're very kind people. So I'm just grateful to have the chance to talk to people. If you're from Grafton or Millbury, or from any district that has Senator Moore, I hope you'll send him an email tomorrow saying, you know, when are you going to bring the Harmony Commission back in, or even if you're from surrounding towns, Northbridge, Uxbridge, Mendon, Upton, you know, contact your state reps and say, listen, we're supporting Senator Moore's Harmony Commission. Can you please help us out? That's why I'm trying to do a lot of these things, to let people know. So thanks for listening. That's a long story.
Thank you.